I've been making videos on YouTube about software engineering, mostly about .NET for a couple of years now, but I've been working in the industry for over a decade. Like most people, I went to university, but I didn't study computer science. I'm a self-taught software developer. Let's talk about that. So first of all, this video is definitely not an opinion piece on whether it's worth going to university to study computer science or not if you want to be a software developer. To be honest, I'm not qualified to say whether I think a CS degree is worth it because I didn't do one. But what I can do is give you my perspective as someone who went down a, should we say, less than conventional route. The biggest thing I want to try and help people with in this video is imposter syndrome, because as someone who didn't follow a traditional path academically into the field that I'm in, I've suffered with imposter syndrome quite significantly throughout my career. And because of some of the experiences I've had, I've been able to gain confidence, and that imposter syndrome now has pretty much gone, which is great. But not everyone has the luxury of being able to draw on experience. So hopefully, by drawing on mine, you'll see that it is more than possible to get into software engineering, to maintain a productive career, hopefully lucrative career, as someone who didn't follow the traditional path. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about me. And obviously I'll put chapters in here, so if you get to any boring bits, then you can skip ahead. But I think it makes sense if I start from the very beginning. Obviously I'm from the UK, as you might have guessed from my accent, although I don't have a typical sort of stereotypical London accent. If you're not from the UK, you may notice it's a little bit different. I actually have quite a weak accent, but I'm from a place called Stoke-on-Trent, which is a little bit south of a major city called Manchester. We're not quite in the north of the UK, but the culture is basically the same as the north. I'm like 5 minutes away from Cheshire, so it is basically the north. We like chips and gravy, and we call people duck.
Welcome, Fraser. Look, you're in Stoke-on-Trent.
We also eat these really weird but really nice things called oatcakes, which are like savoury or sometimes sweet crepes. Check them out, North South's Oatcakes. You won't be disappointed. And without talking badly about where I'm from, I obviously love my hometown because it's home, but it's not the most affluent place in the world. Stoke-on-Trent is unfortunately quite deprived. The main industry in the past was pottery. It's actually referred to as the potteries, but that industry has massively declined, and by the time I was born in the 80s, the pottery industry was on its way out. Now Stoke-on-Trent is known for call centres and warehouses, but there are some software firms. It just means that competition is a little bit higher. But it's the kind of place where if you're a little bit different to the norm, it really sticks out. The way I was different was that I was very naturally musical. This is definitely not a humble brag. When I say things about being musical, it's going to sound like I'm bragging. I'm really not bragging. Essentially, when I was really small, my parents found out that I had a real ear for music. I could listen to something that I'd heard and just play it on the keyboard. They bought me this little tiny toy keyboard. I started playing music that they'd heard on the radio, and they were like, okay, he can play, no one's ever taught him, so let's get him some lessons. The school actually advised me to get piano lessons, and that was it then. From age 6 or 7 up to leaving home at 18, I was the piano guy. If you heard Nick Proud, it was, oh, the guy who plays the piano. And, you know, I can play the piano pretty well. It comes naturally to me. I learned to read music. I did all the usual piano grades. So it was pretty well known that that was what I did, and it was kind of assumed by everyone around me that that's what I was going to do forever. I was also in every school play. I was acting. Anything to do with music or being on stage, I was there. I loved it. What people didn't know is that in the background at home, I was a computer nerd. I'd have bits of old machines that I'd managed to get hold of. As soon as my parents got a PC, I was all over it, learning how it worked. I wanted to understand every part of the machine and how it worked. I was very, very curious about that stuff. I was learning how to build websites in Microsoft Front Page. I wanted to learn what this Visual Basic thing was. And I came home one day, I remember, with an old Amstrad computer and a dot matrix printer someone had given me. And my mum was like, what the hell are you going to do with that? I got it working, and it was a fairly usable computer, even though at that time we were on Windows 95, Windows 98, and here I was rocking an Amstrad. So this was all something that happened. It sounds kind of sordid, but it was happening like behind closed doors. And meanwhile, the public side of it was like, oh, Nick's doing a concert, Nick's playing the piano, Nick's in a play. And it's kind of a weird thing where everyone who's around you saying those things and assuming those things kind of allows you to convince yourself that it's true. And so you just think, okay, well, I'm going to go and do arty A levels. I'm going to go and do an arty degree, and I'm going to somehow make a living, I don't know, playing the piano, acting, doing something creative. I always knew in the back of my mind that I wanted to do more with computers, but it almost felt like I'd gone too far the other way. And I was like, okay, well, that's a hobby now then. I'll focus on arty stuff as my mainline career. So I eventually left home. I was 18 and I moved to London, because if you're going to study the arts, apparently that's where you go. I studied music and drama. I later, after my first year, dropped music, so I ended up with just a full drama degree, which still baffles people when I tell them today, yes, I am a drama graduate. Hopefully that means I'm not over the top, but I don't regret what I did. Sometimes people say, would you have rather studied computer science? And I think back then, no. I was in the middle of everything, and I was meeting new people, and it was great. It was a lot of fun, kind of just goofing off for 3 years. But all the way in the background, there was still computer life, gaming, tinkering, trying out new software, running chat servers. Shout out Merck, that was cool. But again, it still seemed like it should be a hobby. I wouldn't take that any further. So eventually I started to get close to the end of university. We had to figure out what we were going to do with our lives. A bunch of my friends were in a theatre company, and a lot of us wanted to carry on taking that forward and thought, okay, well, we'll go to drama school and we'll get an acting degree next, and then somehow we'll magically be able to become well-paid actors. And that just didn't happen. I got into a couple of drama schools. I auditioned to do a master's in acting, and then it just turned out that I couldn't afford it. So I thought, okay, well, I'll move home for a couple of years, get a job, and save the money and come back. Even though acting had virtually no security, back then I was very young and just thought, I'll make it work somehow. So I moved home to save, and guess what? I didn't save, because suddenly I had a job and some money. I was working an office job. I was even able to do a little bit of IT stuff in this office job, because I'd put my hand up and said that I understood how to fix various different things that happened, and they didn't really have an IT department, so I kind of became a de facto IT department. So it allowed me to start to taste what, semi-professional life as a person working in tech might be like. So at 2021, this was kind of confusing to me, because I'd been through this whole phase of being told you're an arty person, that's what you're going to do. And actually all the stuff that I was doing in the background that no one saw, that I thought was just a hobby, was coming into the forefront. So after a while, I kind of got fed up of sort of doing IT. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to do this properly. And this is a big jump, because I'm going to have to tell everyone who thought I was going to do one thing that actually I want to go and try and do another. And obviously I wanted to have some security. I wanted a regular income, and I wanted to actually sink my teeth into something. Acting is really competitive, just like software development is, but almost horribly so. I remember being at auditions for drama school, and I was the only kid from somewhere like Stoke, and no one knew where it was, and I just felt like an outsider. They'd be talking about all the different auditions they were getting and all the different actors that they'd met, and I just wanted to talk to the point, and I didn't want to be part of this sort of lovey culture that is in theatre and classical music. It's quite, I don't want to say pompous, but that was my experience of it. I know it isn't across the board, but that's just what I saw. Whereas software and tech, it's very logical. It's very to the point, and I liked that. I knew that the best place to start would be to get into some kind of support job. So I thought, okay, how am I going to do this? So I managed to get hold of a license for Windows Server 2003, and I had a spare machine that I could set it up on, and I set up a home network at my parents' house. So I created this LAN, this sort of corporate LAN in my house. We had a server in the basement, or the utility room as we call it here, and I was running Ethernet cables just along the skirting boards through to different rooms. It was awful, but it worked, and I could do things like manage Active Directory, push group policies. I could do a little bit of scripting. I learned how to use Linux. I had a really old NAS OS. I don't even know what it was called. It was that old. But I was serving up shares from a web portal. I learned how TCP/IP works. And this gave me so much knowledge in such a short period of time that eventually I was able to find a pretty simple consulting gig setting up a new office for an organization. The organization had taken over this office and it was a mess. I went in and there was a server in the corner, open with everybody working around it, and the server password was on a piece of paper on the wall next to the server. Anyone could have just walked up and gone, I'm just going to change my password, or I'm going to change your password. Luckily, this wasn't the kind of place where people understood what it did and they were kind of scared of it, so they just left it alone. But still, day one of my first paid IT job was pretty funny. So that was pretty easy to fix. Just change the password and get rid of the piece of paper on the wall. But then I had to figure out how to work with patch cables and networking printers and re-imaging machines. But I put everything into it and I managed to walk away from that very brief contract with a happy customer that said they were able to work much more efficiently now that they had auto-mapped drives and printers that talked to each other. And I had something on my CV which showed that I could work in the industry professionally. But I still had a long way to go. I was in my early 20s, I was very green, and a lot of my knowledge and experience had been tinkering in the background when I could. But I carried on and moved into another set of IT jobs, and I worked mostly in IT support and systems administration, which I loved. I absolutely loved climbing into server bays. If something was wrong and I had to go and actually crawl into a rack to figure something out, I was really happy. But the more and more I did that stuff, the easier it got, obviously. And so I started to think, well, what's next? And I was finding a lot of repetitive things that I was doing as part of my role as a systems admin. I was finding that I was gravitating more towards scripting things than working in a GUI. So I was writing a lot of batch scripts. PowerShell was kind of becoming the norm back then. Wow, I sound really old. So I was finding myself writing a lot of PowerShell scripts. Eventually I moved into a support role which was much more software focused, and it required me to understand how to debug websites and web applications, and so JavaScript was way more prevalent in terms of my day-to-day tool set. We started to work with the support of various different resources in the cloud. So as I was getting into this software support side of my career, I thought, well, I'm not satisfied with just scripting. I'm going to start learning how to properly code. I'd actually started learning C# way back when I was working for a manufacturing firm supporting their infrastructure. We had a lot of in-house software that controlled robotic arms in the factory, which had to be closely supported. It was actually written in Visual Fox Pro, which I know that most of the people watching this video will have never even heard of. I hadn't until I got to this job. But we started to actually convert it into a modern language, and that language was C#. But I was also having to do a lot of SQL because I was supporting the back end of the applications. But it was very dangerous. If I put the wrong value into a column in a table, it could set off a robotic arm in the factory downstairs, which is not ideal. So as I got closer and closer to software, it made me realize that the little bit of coding that I'd done was actually the most fun I'd had in this whole IT journey. So I spent every little bit of time I had perfecting my game in terms of code. I was consuming YouTube content, reading books, making my own applications. I thought if I can understand the basics, that's great, but I have to actually build something. And once I started to feel confident, I thought, how am I going to transplant this into my actual working day? I need to find an excuse to make it so that I have to write code. Well, at the time in the team I was in, we were doing a lot of configuration of Hyper-V virtual machines, and it was quite repetitive. They were all very similar. And I thought, yeah, we could definitely automate this. So I wrote a C# application that wrapped around a lot of the PowerShell that we could use to spin these VMs up. And so what I built was a configuration form you could fill in, say what kind of spec you would want, and then click build, and guess what? It would go and build it. I think I'd started to unwittingly make myself known as the person who said, we can automate that, which was, looking back, super important, because if I've not built a reputation, then how am I going to expect to be given a chance to move into that area full time? So again, I made it a point of having a checkpoint with myself every sort of 3 to 6 months to think, what's my next game plan? And after building this app, I was super confident because it was being used professionally, that I thought the only way that this is really going to happen for me where I currently am is for me to say to my boss, hey, I want to be a software developer full time. You know I can code. Next time there's a job opening, consider me for it. And that's what they did. Now, I know you're probably thinking, Nick, it's not that simple. Well, yeah, it really isn't that simple. There was a lot of stuff that happened way before that. My journey isn't just about saying, okay, I taught myself how to code and then I became a software developer. I actually had to get my foot into the IT world and then prove that I could be a software developer. But nobody was going to tell me how to do it. So I had to figure it out myself, and it will be exactly the same for anyone who's in a similar position that I was when I just came out of university. So maybe it is because I put myself out there, and maybe that's why I do these YouTube videos. It's probably linked to what I studied at university. I'm more comfortable speaking to people publicly than a lot of developers are. Sounds like a stereotype, but I think we can all accept that a lot of developers just want to be left alone, they want to write code with their headphones on, and they want to get into a flow. So that was an advantage for me. Not only could I actually solve the technical problem, but I could explain it to people in a way that they would understand. So if you take anything from that first part, it's that I made myself visible and I showcased my abilities whilst also not being scared to do so. For other people, the equivalent of that might be that you've contributed heavily to an open source project, or you've solved X number of coding questions on Stack Overflow, or you've just built a bunch of websites and they're in your portfolio. But even that could be the same as what I did to get into software development full time. The only difference is that I was already in that IT world, so in some way I had a bit of an advantage. But identifying that advantage and exploiting it, that's key, and that applies to everyone. So I eventually moved into software development full time, and pretty soon I was made a lead dev on my own product, which was an automation based product, shock horror. But again, that's all based on the reputation that I built as someone who loved to automate things. But I was thrown in at the deep end, and this is something that I say to people all the time who are in similar situations. Don't expect it to be easy, and if you do get there, it doesn't end there. The challenges will always continue. For example, the app that I was given as the product lead was old. You could call it legacy, but that's probably just a nice way of saying old. It was written in VB6. Now, as a C# and JavaScript developer, it was definitely a new challenge, but I just chucked myself into it. And I honestly think that they were kind of testing me by saying, hey, look, yeah, we get it. You can write C#, you can write JavaScript, but can you learn something else quickly? After learning VB6, I kind of got Stockholm Syndrome for it. It became a little bit of a comfort blanket, even though it was primarily in use when I was like 5 years old. But again, if I had have just said, oh, I will only do C#, I'll only do JavaScript, then I would have severely hampered my chances of progressing. Eventually I got involved in more things around the product as well as coding, so I was involved in a lot more marketing activities. We started doing videos until I left that organization and joined the one I'm at now, Nextbotics, as a lead developer, working my way up to director level, adapting the same practices, which is identify your strengths, make them visible, and keep improving. Ultimately, it sounds cheesy, but you're not going to get anywhere unless you put yourself out there. The danger is that you feel like you can't put yourself out there because you're not allowed. And that's the imposter syndrome. For so many years, working as a software developer, I was surrounded by people who had studied computer science at university, who were really, really clever. And I had two options. I could either think, yeah, I'm never going to be as good as them, or actually, they're my new benchmark for how good I need to be at a minimum. I'm convinced that if I wasn't surrounded by people who hadn't been graduates of computer science, that I would never have pushed myself to make sure I had the same, if not more, knowledge than them. Would I have ever learned C, or what Big O was, or how to optimize different sorting algorithms if I wasn't surrounded by people who just knew this stuff implicitly? Probably not. So another piece of advice would be to not be afraid to surround yourself by people who have done the degree in computer science, because they're a reminder to you that there's a lot of really important stuff that they teach you at university that you won't have been able to cover as a self-taught developer or someone who's been to a boot camp. There's a difference between knowing how to code and knowing how a computer works, but having both of those things makes you dangerous. And it doesn't matter whether you've been to university or not, you can still have that knowledge. You just have to work a little bit harder for it. You'll eventually come to the point where your imposter syndrome will hopefully fade away, because the proof is in the pudding. If you've delivered stuff that works and works well, then you have just as much a right to be here as the people who've been to university to study the subject academically. Now, Do I think you should go to university to study computer science? I can't answer that question. That's not the point of this video. But should you decide not to, or if you're a little bit older and you've already been to university, or you're not looking to go to university, then hopefully you'll take away from this that it's still possible. It might be harder, but it's still possible. I've met a lot of people who are software engineers who have degrees similar to mine, and they've seen real success. Again, largely because they have those added soft skills that they have acquired from doing an arts degree, whether it be music, drama, or even history. I'm not saying that you have to go and do a creative writing course to become a software engineer. I'm saying that it helps you become a more rounded person. It's not that computer science graduates are one-track minds that are just about the theory of computation, but it's kind of swings and roundabouts. People who've done computer science will come out with a lot of the foundational knowledge imprinted into them, but potentially not as many of the soft skills. And that might be fine if they want to aspire to be a senior developer, software architect. And that's not to say that you don't have soft skills if you do a computer science degree, but they, like me with computer science itself, have the added overhead of making sure that they train themselves in that subject. And on the other side, people who've done the arts degrees, who are comfortable speaking in public, who can communicate quite clearly and maybe think outside the box a little bit, have the added overhead of making sure that they've got the technical foundations. I'd argue that it's probably harder for you if you've not been to university for computer science, but if you can really put the effort into learning those technical foundations in your own time, combine that with your soft skills from an arts degree, and I think I'm proof that you can definitely get somewhere. So again, I'm going to end it there before people think that I'm telling them not to go to study computer science. But to all the people out there who are self-taught or are learning to code and want to get into the industry in a non-conventional sense, don't stop. Keep going. It is possible. If you're trying to decide what programming language you want to learn first, C#'s pretty good. To a lot of people, that might be the most controversial thing I've said all video. Thank you for watching, and if you found this useful, then please do comment below. I'd love to understand people's experiences of getting into the industry, whether you went to university for computer science, whether you taught yourself, whether you just found yourself in the role. I don't think I've ever heard of anyone being in that situation, but if you have, I'd love to know about it. Obviously, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're into more content like this. It's quite a different video to what I normally do. I do a lot of C# and .NET content, so if you're interested in that, then of course, like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.